الهدى يا شهر الندى.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه الطيبين الطاهرين. We start with the name of Allah. We praise and thank Allah for all of the endowments that Allah bestowed upon us without Allah being obligated to give us anything. And we ask Allah to raise the rank of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the ranks of his wives, believing relatives, companions, and those who followed them sincerely until Judgment Day. And we ask Allah to protect the nation of Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam from what the Prophet feared for his nation. Thereafter, in the last session, we mentioned conditions for following the Imam. God willing, we will continue with the summary of Shaykh Abdullah al-Harari rahimahullah ta'ala, may Allah have mercy upon him, mentioning some additional conditions for following the Imam. The Shaykh mentioned that among the conditions for following the Imam is that the follower would not have knowledge of the invalidity of the prayer of the Imam. Thus, if the follower knew that the Imam's prayer was invalid, then he would not be allowed to follow him in the prayer, taking him as an Imam. And if he did so, his prayer would be invalid. For example, if he knew that the Imam was not in a state of purification, and so his prayer was invalid due to that, then he would not take this person as an Imam, following him in the prayer. Another condition for following the Imam is that the follower would not consider the Imam's prayer invalid due to a speculative matter. An example is for the Imam to make a determination for the Qibla and the follower to make a determination for the Qibla, for the prayer direction, and for their determinations not to align, so they don't face the same direction in the Qibla, then one would not be allowed to take as an Imam in the prayer one who is praying a different direction for them due to their ijtihad, due to their determination. That is, if two people make differing determinations for finding the prayer direction, then one of them is not to follow the other in the prayer. Another condition for following the Imam is that the follower would not know that the Imam would be required to re-perform his prayer because of a certain matter involved in how he's praying. Sometimes a person would be obligated to pray in their current situation, but then also obligated to, they would pray in a valid prayer in their current situation, but then be obligated to make up that prayer later. Like the one who made tayammum due to lack of water in an area where normally there is water available, then he would be required to make up his prayer. Thus, if the follower knew that the Imam was in such a scenario, then he would not be allowed to follow that Imam in the prayer. Rather, he would avoid that. He would abandon following that one in the prayer. Another condition for following the Imam is that the follower would not have a doubt about the person. Is he an Imam or a follower? Meaning, is he currently following someone else in the prayer? What we learn is that if two people are praying together, then the follower would, it's better for him to stand on the right, and that he would be behind behind the Imam somewhat. And he wouldn't be lined up directly with the Imam with both of their heels side by side. Rather, he would step back somewhat so that the Imam would be forward to a certain extent. However, If they prayed side by side, one of them leading and the other one following, their heels aligned side by side, the follower not being ahead of the Imam, then the prayer would still be valid. So if a third person, for example, came into this scenario and he was unaware, he wasn't sure which one was following and which one was leading, then he wouldn't be allowed to follow one of them while doubting about was he the Imam or the follower. And even more so, he wouldn't follow a person who he was certain was actively following another. This is a scenario if the follower is currently following the Imam. As for if a follower followed an Imam, however, he was masbuq, for example, he came to the prayer late and he missed a cycle of the prayer of the Imam, for example. And then after the Imam completed his prayer, this follower stood up to continue his prayer, and another individual came and intended to follow him and join him in the prayer, taking him as an Imam, then the prayer would be valid. The prayer would be valid in that scenario. Another condition for following the Imam is that the Imam would not be someone who does not recite the Fatiha properly. So one is not allowed to take as an Imam the individual who does not recite the Fatiha properly. This person would not be taken as a leader in the prayer. And the final matter mentioned here among the conditions for following the Imam is that the man would not take a woman as an Imam, nor would he take what's called khuntha mushkil as an Imam. The khuntha mushkil is the hermaphrodite whose gender has not yet become known. A hermaphrodite is a person who was born with the genitalia of both genders. That they have apparently the genitalia of both genders. In reality, they are not a third gender, nor are they both genders. Rather, they would either be male or female. But sometimes it's not absolutely clear which gender they are in reality. So then they would have to live their life a certain way according to the rules of the religion and what the scholars mentioned about to observe observing the reality of their condition and doing things a certain way. So a man would not take a hermaphrodite in this situation as an Imam due to the possibility that in reality it's a woman. So they would avoid following that person in the prayer. And with that, the author mentioned additional matters that are conditions for following the Imam. With that, the author continued, he moved on into the next section of his summary, which pertains to dealing with the funeral prayer and matters pertaining to that. The author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, said, the funeral. He said, washing, shrouding, praying for, and burying the dead Muslim. Alhamdulillah. And burying the dead Muslim is a communal obligation if they were born alive. So it's a communal obligation, meaning that if it was fulfilled by some, then those who did not participate would not be sinful. However, if no one fulfilled this obligation for the dead Muslim, then everyone who knew about it would be sinful. So, washing, this is something that must be done to the dead Muslim, washing his body with purifying water. Something that resembles a ghusl, even to the extent that some scholars listed it as the causes, the matters that necessitate a ghusl, they consider death as one of them, and along with ejaculation, sexual intercourse, determination of menses, determination of postpartum bleeding and childbirth, they mention death as a sixth matter. Shrouding, and this is when the Muslim is wrapped up in cloth, praying for the funeral prayer and burying the dead Muslim. These are a communal obligation if they were born alive. However, if they were born dead, then the prayer is dropped. A child is considered to be born alive if, when he was born, he cries, for example, that's considered a sign of life, or has voluntary movements. That's also considered a sign of life. He said, it is an obligation to shroud and bury the dhimmi, which is a kafir who pays dues to the Muslim ruler. In the past, the Muslims used to go out and perform the jihad, and they would go to the non-Muslim lands and call those people to Islam. If they embraced Islam, then they would, keep their money, and they would not be fought, and they would, be under the caliph. They would be under the rule of the caliph. They would become a part of the Muslim world and the Muslim society, and the caliph would deal with them according to the rules of the religion. If they abstained, then they would be told to pay the jizya. They would be presented with paying the jizya, and this is what we mean here. This is what the dhimmi does. This non-believer who pays the jizya, which is a once-a-year payment, and it's a once-in-a-year payment that they would pay to the Muslim ruler, and then they would be governed by the Muslim state. They would have certain rights, and among their rights is that if they died and their people didn't take care of it, that the Muslims would shroud and bury them. Of course, they are not prayed for because they are still non-believers. And so we don't ask Allah the Exalted to have mercy on them or any matters pertaining to their hereafter of mercy or reward. However, they would have these rights as the religion conveys. They would be shrouded and they would be buried. We wouldn't bury them in the Muslim cemeteries because they're not Muslims, but they would be buried. He said, it is also an obligation to wash, shroud, and bury the stillborn. And we mentioned we mentioned about the one who's born alive, and the stillborn is the one who was born dead. So he's born not showing signs of life. However, he has the original human form. He has the original human form. So he would be still washed, shrouded, and buried. He said, however, the funeral prayer is not performed for neither the dhimmi or the stillborn, as we mentioned. He said, the person who dies in combat against non-Muslims, which is called Shahidul Ma'raka, the martyr of the battlefield, this being their cause of death, meaning they died due to the fighting, is shrouded in their battle attire, their battle clothes. If these clothes are not enough, more material is added until it became sufficient, that is. They are not buried, nor are they washed or prayed for. And this is because they are not in need of our supplication. Because with their martyrdom, all of their sins are forgiven. Their souls would enter paradise immediately, and etc. among the great honors and mercies that Allah the Exalted makes shower upon the martyr of the battlefield. The author, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy upon him, said, the minimum requirement for washing is to remove the najis filth and to use purifying water to wash all of the dead person's skin and hair, even if the hair was thick, once. So this is the bare minimum that one would do for washing the dead. They would remove whatever najis filth was on their body, whether it was blood or urine or feces or vomit, etc. and then they would make sure that their whole body was rinsed, all of the hair and skin, similar to how we do for the ghusl for the living person. I mean, how a person washes themselves for a ghusl when alive. He said, the minimum requirement for the shroud is that which covers the whole body, the entire body. 3 wraps are used for the one who died and left an inheritance that exceeds their debts and is not and did not request to leave out being wrapped with 3 wraps. So if the Muslim died and he left money behind that was in excess of his debts, meaning that after his outstanding debts were paid, there was money remaining, then he would be wrapped with 3 wraps. However, if he left a will to abandon wrapping him 3 times, then he could be wrapped once. So that's quite simple, as you can see. The washing is a rather simple affair when it comes to the minimum washing, and then the shrouding is also something that is quite simple. And there are additional recommended aspects to both of these matters that a person would look into in more extensive books of fiqh. He said the minimum requirement for the funeral prayer, the minimum requirements for the funeral prayer are to intend to pray the prayer for the dead person. So they would specify this dead person. If they know them by name, for example, they would specify them, or they would specify the present dead, or they could pray for the one who the Imam is praying for example. And that it is obligatory, because here we're talking about that, the obligatory funeral prayer, along with specifying it as a funeral prayer. So the person in his intention, he intends the person they're praying for, its obligation, and that they are praying the funeral prayer. He said to say Allahu Akbar while standing if able. So, of course, the opening takbirah, the opening saying of Allahu Akbar, will be simultaneous with the intention. He said to recite the Fatiha. Yes, it's an obligation to recite the Fatiha within the funeral prayer. It doesn't have to be after the first takbirah, but that's what is very common amongst people, and it's a good place to recite it. However, if he recited it after any of the takbirat, it would be valid. He said to say Allahu Akbar. So this is the second time he says Allahu Akbar. The first time he began the prayer with the intention. Then he recites Al-Fatiha. Then he says Allahu Akbar a second time. Then he says the Salah on the Prophet, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. And this integral must be after the second takbirah. It's not like the Fatiha recitation. He's not allowed to do that after any of the takbirahs that he chooses. Rather, he must send the Salah upon the Prophet after the second takbirah. Then he says Allahu Akbar a third time, and then he makes supplication for the dead, a supplication that pertains to their hereafter. He said to supplicate to Allah to forgive and have mercy on that dead Muslim. So a person could say in Arabic, for example, Allahumma ghfir lahu warhamah. Allahumma ghfir lahu warhamah. For example, he could say that, which means, oh Allah, forgive him and have mercy upon him. And this supplication, as we mentioned, would be after the third takbirah. Then he would say the takbirah a fourth time, and he's allowed but not obligated to make additional supplication, like what he learned from what was narrated from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But this is not a requirement, it's not an integral. So if he left that out and just remained silent after saying the fourth takbirah until he said the salam, then that would be valid. And finally, he says to say the closing salam. So he says assalamu alaikum, that's to complete the prayer. He said it's mandatory in this prayer, that is the funeral prayer, to satisfy the conditions of prayer and to avoid its invalidators. So a person, for example, would be clear of the najis filth on their body, clothing, place of prayer, and what they carry. They would be clear of the 2 states of ritual impurity, the major and the minor. They would cover the unlawful nakedness. They would direct themselves towards the qibla, etc. And they would avoid the invalidators of the prayer, so they wouldn't make many moves. They wouldn't, for example, speak speech of the people during the prayer, not one letter with a meaning or even two letters that don't contain a meaning, etc. He wouldn't intend to interrupt the prayer or make interrupting the prayer contingent on something. He wouldn't eat or drink anything. And the matters that we mentioned in the previous sessions pertaining to invalidators of the prayer. And then the Sheikh mentioned the minimum requirement for the burial is an excavation that masks the odor of the dead person and protects their body from predatory animals. So this is the minimum, that he would be buried deep enough that no smell would escape, nor would it be so shallow that predatory beasts could dig him up and thus ravage his body. He said, it is recommended, sunnah, to have the grave dug as deep as a man's height with his arms extended over his head. And here we're talking about a man of average height, that the grave would be the depth of an average height man with his hand extended over his head. The depth of an average height man with his hand extended over his head. The Sheikh mentioned that that's 4.5 cubits. 4.5 cubits. So if a cubit is 1.5 feet, then 4 cubits would be 6 feet, and a half of cubit would be 9 inches, approximately. So you're talking about approximately 6 foot 9 inches deep for the grave. He said, it is an obligation to direct the dead person towards the Qibla. Yes, in the Shafi'i school, it's mandatory to direct the chest of the dead towards the Qibla, which in North America is southeast. He said it is unlawful to bury the dead in a mausoleum. And a mausoleum is a structure where sometimes people put their dead, and it doesn't protect the people from their smell. So it doesn't protect the people from the smell of the dead person, and so it's prohibited to put the dead there, for us to place the dead in this type of structure, this mausoleum. And Allah the Exalted knows best. With that, we've completed the section of purification and prayer from the summary of Shaykh Abdullah al-Harari. May Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, and may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on myself and you. Walhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. God willing, if we continue, then maybe we'll move on to the section of the obligations of the heart and the sins of the heart and other organs. And Allah the Exalted knows best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
يا شهر الخيرات والإحسان والبركات يا رمضان